They tied the black CEO to his chair, calling him a threat, only to realize minutes later he was a top presidential agent. What happens next will leave you speechless. They silenced him before asking who he was. 10 minutes later, they were the ones trembling. If you believe in truth, justice, and real accountability, hit that subscribe button now. The metal chair was cold. Caden Miles felt the sting of the zip restraints biting into his wrists before he even had the chance to ask a single question. His ankles were locked down next, leather straps looped with a speed and certainty that told him this wasn't a spontaneous act of caution, it was a deliberate takedown. The gag came last, a thick gray cloth jammed into his mouth and tied cruelly behind his head. "Subject secured," one of the guards muttered into his radio. The lounge had gone quiet. Not a complete hush, but that awkward, heavy silence people adopt when they witness something they think they should ignore. A few passengers across the waiting area lowered their coffee cups and stared. Others looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't seen a man in a tailored black suit being tied to a chair in the corner of a luxury terminal like a threat on display. Caden didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But his eyes stayed sharp and unblinking, locked onto the closest guard with a coldness that made the man hesitate before stepping back. The officer's badge read Menders, Joel Menders, and he stood with one hand still on the hilt of his taser, like he expected Caden to break free with brute force. Menders had that look in his eye, the kind that wasn't just suspicious, it was already certain. Certain that whatever explanation Caden might offer didn't matter, certain that he was doing the right thing. Moments earlier, none of this had existed. Caden had walked through the polished marble floor of Altera Airlink's private terminal with the measured confidence of someone used to being invisible. His briefcase had passed through the scanner without issue, his ID badge embedded on a secure chip, and his demeanor calm and deliberate. He was dressed simply, black suit, navy shirt, no tie, and he carried himself with the kind of efficiency that made people overlook him. Until Menders saw him. From the moment their eyes met across the terminal lobby, Caden had sensed it. Something cold, something judgmental. Menders didn't break eye contact. He leaned to whisper to a younger officer standing beside him. A subtle nod followed. Then they moved. "You didn't check in through proper clearance," Menders had said, stepping in front of Caden just as he reached the boarding gate. Caden's voice had remained steady. "My ID is embedded, level 9 clearance. You'll see the authorization if you scan the code on the upper corner." "Doesn't matter," Menders interrupted, waving over another guard. "You've been flagged. Random screening. Hands where I can see them." Caden frowned. "Flagged by who?" "Protocol." Menders didn't blink. "You match a threat descriptor." "I have authorization from Ardent Hall," Caden stated, slowly reaching into his coat pocket. "You'll find—" "I said hands where I can see them," Menders barked, stepping forward now. The younger guard looked hesitant but followed the lead. In less than 30 seconds, the two had grabbed Caden's arms, yanked him away from the gate, and shoved him down into the black chair now bolted to the terminal floor, supposedly for security emergencies. A gag had been added, Menders claimed, for safety reasons. The tension that followed was quiet but dangerous. Caden sat motionless, forcing himself to remain calm. Every movement he made had to be calculated. He knew better than anyone that a single wrong twitch could be interpreted as resistance, something these men seemed eager to confirm. Inside his mind, the gears turned. He could activate his biometric signal. It would send a distress alert to Ardent Hall, the Republic's Central Intelligence Command, bypassing surface encryption and triggering a security review. But the activation required subtlety. He needed to slow his pulse below a certain threshold for 3 consecutive seconds. That wasn't easy when your hands were bound and your mouth was gagged in a room full of strangers pretending not to see you. Still, Caden began the sequence, breathing in through his nose, counting, letting the anger rise but not control him. He needed his body to obey the logic his mind whispered. "You're not in danger. You're in control." Nearby, one of the passengers whispered to another, "What's going on?" "Must have tried to sneak in," someone replied. "You don't just end up in a chair like that." But he had followed protocol. He had presented his ID. That didn't matter. What mattered was that Joel Menders had looked at a man like Caden and seen something suspicious, not because of his briefcase, not because of his behavior, but because of the color of his skin and the confidence in his walk. Menders walked past again, checking the gag like it was part of standard procedure. His eyes swept the room with misplaced pride as if waiting for applause. But there was no applause, only a slow hum of discomfort as some travelers packed away their devices and quietly boarded without making eye contact. One guard asked hesitantly, "You think he's really dangerous?" Menders didn't answer at first. Then, "They always say they're government. Always have some kind of story. It's part of the act." Caden kept his gaze steady, unreadable. He could still feel the cold of the chair seep into his spine. The edges of the restraints pressed deeper now, but he didn't react. Every second bought him another moment of silence, another step toward the next move. Behind his stillness, behind the gag and the tailored suit and the guarded expression, something deeper had begun to stir. He had seen this before, in boardrooms, on missions, at checkpoints. Fear dressed as authority, and this time they had wrapped it in straps and wrapped it around him. Somewhere in the corner, a flight assistant spoke into a radio. "Boarding continues. Lounge secure. Passenger 19 in containment." That was the moment Caden's biometric failsafe kicked in. Halfway across the city, in a blacked-out room filled with screens and satellite pings, a red dot blinked to life at Ardent Hall. One of the intelligence analysts leaned forward. "We've got a stress level code red. Tier 1 operative. ID tag confirms it, Caden Miles." Back in the terminal, no one noticed that the climate control unit flickered, or that a shadow near the janitor's closet moved a fraction of an inch. Caden, silent and still, had sent the first signal. And while the guards stood proud over what they believed was containment, none of them had realized they had just tripped a deeper wire, one wired into the heart of the Republic's defense intelligence. He stared at Menders with the same cold calm as before. They thought they were securing the terminal, without realizing they'd just locked down the wrong man. Strapped to the chair with zip restraints biting into his wrists, Caden Miles sat perfectly still, his back straight, his breathing controlled. The harsh fluorescent lights above cast sharp shadows across the sterile white floors of the boarding lounge, while the low hum of conversations and distant boarding announcements filled the air. Despite the chaos around him, the world inside Caden's mind had gone eerily quiet, sharpened into a tunnel of calm calculation. "Passenger 19 has been restrained, awaiting further instructions," muttered a voice to his right. It was Nolan Trask, the assistant supervisor of Altera Airlink's terminal staff. He held a small black handheld radio close to his lips, his tone laced with nervous pride. The phrase, "Passenger 19, echoed strangely in Caden's ears, dehumanizing, deliberate, as though he were nothing more than a number on a manifest. Trask stood with his shoulders stiff, eyes darting from Caden to the security checkpoint as if seeking validation for what he'd done. But he wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for justification. Caden's gaze lifted slowly to meet Trask's. His expression remained unreadable, but behind the silence his thoughts were anything but still. They didn't ask his name. They didn't scan his ID. They didn't question why a man in a tailored suit with a Republic-marked briefcase might be traveling alone, without commotion. They just acted, driven by something older than policy and deeper than protocol. Suspicion had a face in their minds, and to them, Caden Miles wore it perfectly. The zip restraints dug deeper as he shifted slightly, testing their tension. Too tight to slip out without injury, but not impossible. He noted the placement of the nearest surveillance camera overhead, turned slightly to the left, likely wouldn't catch Trask's body blocking the view. Sloppy. The gag across his mouth had been added as a final insult, just tight enough to muffle, not silence. Not that he'd bothered to speak. The moment they bound him to that chair, Caden knew his words would be wasted. What mattered now wasn't noise, it was signal. He closed his eyes and focused. His heart, though steady, pulsed with a low, deliberate throb. Years of field training had taught him how to suppress emotion and regulate stress responses. But buried beneath the surface of his training was something even more valuable, a biometric failsafe built specifically for operatives of his rank. If his pulse rhythm shifted into a specific pattern under duress, something no one could fake, it would send a silent distress beacon to the Republic's highest-level security vaults. He drew a slow breath, then another, slowed the beat just enough, paused. A faint flutter beneath his skin. Then the signal fired. Ping. 30 miles away, buried beneath the marble columns of Ardent Hall, the President's fortified intelligence wing, a red icon blinked on a security console inside Vault Section 4. No sound, no alarm, just a change in data flow, but for the men trained to monitor such readings, it was as loud as a siren. Inside the lounge, nothing had changed. Passengers continued to walk past, occasionally glancing at the bound man in the corner. A few looked confused. Most didn't stop. A child tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering, "Why is that man tied up?" The father murmured something and turned away. Caden's eyes reopened, sharp as glass. Trask was now arguing with a uniformed agent near the boarding bridge. "He didn't follow check-in protocol," Trask hissed, gesturing at Caden. "Said he had clearance but refused to show the proper credentials." "He tried to flash some kind of digital code," said Joel Menders, the ground security agent who'd originally flagged Caden. His jaw was tight, defensive. "Could have been anything, some encrypted fake. We've seen those before." "And his case," Trask added, eyes narrowing at the sleek black briefcase sitting just out of reach on the floor. "He wouldn't let go of it. That's what raised the real flag." If they had known what the briefcase truly held, they might have handled this very differently. Inside the reinforced carbon shell of that case sat a chip, small, unassuming, and pulsing with a soft green light. It was no ordinary data drive. It was a failsafe, coded to interact with the Republic's strategic defense grid, capable of preventing a full system breach that had been forecasted in recent intelligence briefings. The window for upload was narrow. Delay it too long, and entire sectors of military intelligence would go dark, vulnerable to external manipulation. And now the man entrusted with protecting that chip was gagged and tied in a boarding lounge by his own country's airline staff. Caden tilted his head slightly. He watched Trask's hands tremble as he spoke into his radio again. Watched the younger guard at the far end, barely out of training, shift nervously and glance over at him. "Did we make a mistake?" the guard muttered under his breath to Menders. Menders scoffed. "He didn't follow orders. That's all that matters." But Caden saw the flicker of doubt. It was small, but it was there. In his mind, Caden replayed the steps of his mission. Encrypt the chip, transport it under diplomatic shadow, deliver it to the Coburn Defense Summit within 8 hours. He had accounted for delays, security checks, even sabotage, but not this. Not restraint based on nothing more than the tone of his voice and the color of his skin. He was silent now, but the data pulse from his body had already spoken louder than any protest could. Somewhere, Riker Vale, his closest intelligence contact, would be moving into action. Backup was on its way. The question wasn't if they'd arrive, it was when, and whether this terminal would still be standing when they did. Caden's fingertips tensed ever so slightly, every breath measured, every thought sharp. The storm hadn't started yet, but it would. The young guard paced a few steps, his boots echoing faintly on the tiled floor. "I don't know, man," he said to no one in particular. "He just doesn't feel like a threat." Trask's voice cracked across the room. "He didn't have a boarding tag. That's all that matters." But it didn't. And in that moment, as the tension simmered beneath sterile silence and nervous glances, somewhere beyond the airport walls, the first lockdown gates began to shift. If they had opened the case, they would have discovered they weren't detaining a threat. They were sitting on one. Level 3 passenger compromise suspected. Confirm and isolate. The alert flashed across the small data screen on the control panel in the cockpit of Flight A-29. Pilot Jarek Donovan stared at it, frowning. The message had come directly from Central Command, coded, urgent, and vague. He turned to his co-pilot, who shrugged, equally baffled. "We don't have any reports of disruption on board," Jarek muttered, tapping the console. "Passenger 19. Who is that?" Back in the terminal lounge, Caden Miles sat strapped to the black metal chair, his wrists locked in tight restraints, his mouth still bound by the gag. He was silent, but every muscle in his body was alert. He had stopped speaking the moment they tied him down, not out of fear, but calculation. He understood now that words would not save him here. They had chosen to see a threat, and so that's all they would allow themselves to see. Joel Menders crouched beside him, adjusting one of the straps with practiced precision. He spoke over his shoulder to Assistant Supervisor Nolan Trask, who stood nearby, arms crossed. "He kept saying he worked for the government. You know how they do that, trying to bluff their way out." Trask grunted. "Doesn't matter what he said. No boarding confirmation, no matching pass. It's all protocol." But his voice carried a nervous edge, a slight tremor beneath the authority. Caden's eyes stayed on Trask, unmoving, cold, controlled. The restraint on his body was not mirrored in his gaze. It was sharp enough to cut glass. Behind the mask of calm, his mind raced through possibilities, variables, and outcomes. He had triggered the biometric failsafe 5 minutes ago. If all systems responded correctly, help would be on its way. But timing was critical. He had to hold. Miles away, deep within the heavily fortified walls of Ardent Hall, a blinking red signal pulsed across the surveillance grid. The room dimmed as overhead lights flickered blue, alerting the presence of a top-tier emergency. Agent Riker Vale stood at the edge of the command center, tall and severe, his features carved in tension. The moment he saw the signal, he didn't hesitate. "Package compromised. Field unit with me. Wheels up in 60 seconds," he barked, already moving toward the weapons vault. Behind him, a team of federal operatives armed and mobilized without question. As Riker strapped on his tactical vest, one of his lieutenants asked, "Sir, confirmation?" Riker's voice was steel. "It's Miles, and we've got 10 minutes before they cross the point of no return." Back at the airport, beneath the bright glow of the departure bay lights, a janitor hunched over a mop bucket near gate B12. His uniform was worn, his movements slow, unremarkable to the average observer. But as soon as the ping hit the subdermal receiver embedded behind his left ear, the man straightened. Kelrin Maddox, Operative, Embedded Observer. 2 years on silent watch. He glanced around once, calmly parked the mop in the bucket, and reached into his side pocket, pulling out a micro-recorder the size of a pen cap. With a quick flick, the device activated and he raised it toward the terminal glass, zooming in on the lounge where Caden sat bound. From his angle, he could see the guards, the crew, and the spectators. "Confirmed visual," he muttered into his collar mic. "Subject restrained, broadcasting footage to Ardent Hall now." Inside the terminal, Trask and Menders were too busy arguing to notice the slow ripple of consequence starting to sweep in. "I'm telling you, I should be the one to file the report," Trask snapped. "You were the one who hesitated." "Hesitated?" Menders scoffed. "I was making sure we followed proper procedure, unlike you charging in the second you saw him standing alone." He looked off. "That's all I needed." Caden watched them. He knew the game they were playing. Blame deflection. CYA protocol, cover your actions. But their words meant nothing. The clock was ticking, and the real consequences had already left their hands. Suddenly, the digital information board above the gate blinked, glitched, and then went black. The terminal lights followed, one row at a time, dimming in odd sequences before returning in sharp flickers. Passengers murmured, confused, some lifting their heads from phones or boarding passes. "Technical fault?" Menders asked. "No," Caden thought. "Not technical. Tactical." The airport's internal systems were beginning to respond to the triggered failsafe. Caden's pulse-encoded distress alert had reached the nexus of the Republic's digital defenses. That meant one thing. The security grid was no longer under the terminal's control. Jarek Donovan sat rigid in the cockpit as the dashboard lights flickered. Flight controls reinitialized. A soft, unreadable error ran across the screen. "Command priority override. External diagnostic lock." "What the?" he muttered. "That's not from us." He tried contacting ground control, but the audio link returned static. Back in the lounge, the terminal doors leading to the boarding ramp suddenly froze mid-cycle. The metal lock mechanisms clanked and then sealed shut. A traveler reached for the door's handle and recoiled as sparks flickered from the panel beside it. Trask reached for his radio. "This is Trask at Bravo 12. We've got system malfunctions across the gate, requesting override clearance." No response. Then the overhead announcement system stuttered. The usual polite voice was gone, replaced by static bursts. The passengers looked around. One child began to cry softly. Menders stepped toward the window, watching as runway lights blinked erratically across the tarmac. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "Something is very wrong." Caden's eyes drifted closed just for a second. The chaos was building as predicted. The more they struggled to control it, the tighter the net would close. It wasn't revenge he wanted. It was exposure. Every second they kept him bound was another second their judgment became a matter of record. Back outside, Kelrin adjusted the angle of his lens, capturing the tremble in the younger guard's hands as he hovered near the restraints. Inside the airport's network hub, unseen to all of them, a sequence of security layers lifted. The final lock, titled Griffin Failgate, began to blink in override red. Caden opened his eyes and stared directly at Trask. They had tied up a storm they didn't know was wired to strike. The first flicker was subtle, just a slight dimming of the overhead lights in the terminal. A second later, they surged back to full brightness. Then another flicker. Then a third, longer this time. The hum of the air conditioning unit stuttered, and somewhere in the distance the rolling wheels of a luggage cart skidded to a halt. The lights died for exactly 2 seconds. When they returned, a low murmur spread through the boarding lounge. Nolan Trask looked up from his tablet, brow creased. "That's the second blackout in 5 minutes," he muttered, tapping the screen. It didn't respond. Around him, other security personnel started whispering. Some tapped into earpieces. Others checked phones and devices, none of which were connecting to the terminal's secure network. Firewalls were down. Gate software refused to load. Digital signage glitched with static. The boarding gate froze in standby. At the boarding bridge, the aircraft's door remained open, but boarding had halted without explanation. But to Caden Miles, still bound in the metal chair at the far end of the lounge, the flickers weren't signs of a technical malfunction. They were confirmation. Each blackout was a response, a signal from the failsafe he had triggered through biometric stress response. Somewhere deep in the Republic's defense mainframe, his encrypted pulse signature had forced a cascade of digital defenses into motion. The ripple was no longer confined to the terminal. Inside the cockpit of Flight A29, the pilot's console blinked with warning lights. Auto-checks reset themselves. Radio comms buzzed with static. A red notification blinked in the upper right of the screen. Unauthorized detainment protocol. Level 3 alert. But the pilot hadn't detained anyone. Confused, he reached for the handset to contact the gate, unaware that the situation had already passed beyond his control. Outside the terminal, a sleek black vehicle pulled up near the restricted perimeter. A diplomatic emblem glinted on its side. Agent Riker Vale stepped out, tall and imposing, his expression unreadable. 2 military escorts flanked him, their uniforms crisp, eyes alert. Riker's presence was enough to turn heads immediately. He didn't waste time with introductions. At the security post just outside the boarding gate, he raised his identification and held it firmly. "Agent Riker Vale, I need access to the lounge, now." The guard hesitated, startled by the sudden authority. "Sir, protocol says no outside agents can breach active lockdown zones without terminal supervisor clearance." Riker's gaze narrowed. "Then, call your supervisor and let him know the man you've tied to a chair inside is one of the Republic's top-tier security operatives. You have 60 seconds before I override this entire building." Inside, Trask was pacing now, eyes darting between the frozen boarding system and the darkened screen of his tablet. He glanced at Caden, who sat calmly, eyes half closed, breathing steady. His silence was unsettling. Trask turned to one of the younger guards and snapped, "Why is this taking so long? Where's the boarding manifest? Where's my uplink?" The young man, barely out of training, glanced at Caden, then at the disabled systems. "Sir, the database won't load. I think the whole grid it's not responding." "He didn't even have a boarding tag," Trask muttered under his breath. "That's all that matters." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his voice. Across the room, Menders stood stiffly near the service desk, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his temple. "Should we maybe just double-check his ID?" he asked quietly. Trask turned sharply. "We already did. He flashed some code like they all do when they want to look important. If we start bending for every slick suit who claims to be a ghost agent, we'll end up with a security breach on our hands." "You already have one," a voice interrupted from behind the gate. The guards turned. The blast-proof access doors that led from the diplomatic runway had begun to unlock, hydraulic bolts groaning as pressure seals released. Red warning lights flashed once, then went dark. The doors slid open. Riker Vale stepped into the terminal like a storm, finally making landfall. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked slowly, purposefully toward the center of the room, flanked by the military escorts. Every head in the lounge turned to face him. The noise in the terminal dropped to complete silence. Trask swallowed hard, voice catching in his throat. "Sir, I wasn't informed." "I don't need your permission to be informed," Riker cut in, voice low and cold. "You restrained an operative operating under sealed clearance. You delayed a classified transfer. You ignored 3 identity verification failsafes. Congratulations, Mr. Trask. You just committed treason under the Republic Code of Command." Trask's hands trembled slightly. "He didn't have a boarding tag. He refused to follow our process." Riker didn't even look at him. He turned instead to Caden, still seated in the chair. "Are you injured?" Caden's eyes opened fully. Calm. Controlled. Number just disappointed. "Release him," Riker ordered. "Now." Trask didn't move. "Now," Riker repeated, this time with more force. Menders stepped forward first. His hands fumbled at the restraints, fingers shaky as he loosened the cuffs from Caden's wrists. The gag was removed next. The chair creaked as Caden finally stood, flexing his fingers and rolling his shoulders slowly. He looked at Trask, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet scrutiny that made the man look away. Riker's voice snapped across the room again. "You had a chance to ask. Instead, you assumed. Do you even know who you just tied down?" Trask's mouth opened, then closed. Caden's voice, when it came, was smooth but edged with frost. "That's because I don't show anything to cowards who judge before they ask." In the distance, a sharp beep echoed from a security panel, the failsafe timer resetting. The blackout was ending, but the fallout had only just begun. As Riker tapped his communicator to signal clearance approval for Caden's extraction, a low alarm began to pulse in the walls, signaling the arrival of additional operatives to secure the terminal and begin legal processing. Inside his coat, Kelran Maddox continued uploading footage through a stealth uplink, the file titled Incident Echo, Priority Alpha. In another wing of the Republic's Intelligence Command, encrypted alerts had begun reaching the desks of key senators, defense chairs, and oversight officials. And inside the heart of the terminal, where judgment had just unraveled, one of the junior guards leaned toward another and whispered, voice full of regret, "Did we make a mistake?" Trask's jaw clenched, his voice hollow and defiant. He didn't have a boarding tag. That's all that matters. But it didn't. Alarms echoed from outside. The blast-proof doors began to unlock. They were 10 minutes into a disaster they couldn't undo. The blast-proof doors hissed as they slid open with a low mechanical growl. The sound alone silenced the terminal. Every security guard instinctively turned, shoulders stiffening, eyes darting to the entrance. The noise of murmuring passengers and radio chatter vanished like air sucked from the room. Riker Vale stepped through first, his pace calm but unrelenting, like a tide that would not be stopped. Clad in a dark formal coat bearing the seal of the Republic's Executive Intelligence Directorate, he moved with authority that needed no announcement. Behind him, 2 federal operatives flanked his sides, their vests marked with insignias the staff at Varenza rarely saw up close, symbols of rank that outranked everyone present. Without slowing, Riker raised a badge, sleek, metallic, pulsing faintly with encoded clearance. "Release him," he said, his voice low, firm, and final. It echoed in the stillness like a command from the walls themselves. Nolan Trask froze in place. The blood drained from his face as his hand unconsciously dropped the radio he'd been clutching. Joel Menders, still standing near Caden, looked like a man struck by lightning mid-thought, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, unsure whether to speak or move. "I said," Riker repeated, locking eyes with Trask, "release him. Now." No one dared challenge it this time. A younger guard stepped forward hesitantly, fumbling with the restraint latch. The zip straps clicked loose one by one. Caden's arms dropped slightly, aching from the tight compression, but he remained motionless. Another operative moved quickly to remove the gag from his mouth. It dropped to the floor with a soft thud. Caden stood slowly. His muscles protested, but his eyes were calm, focused. He didn't speak. Not yet. He turned, meeting Trask's trembling gaze with a stare that pierced through the man's outer bravado and struck whatever was left of his conscience. Riker's boots echoed as he stepped to the center of the room. His tone sharpened. "Do you even know who you just tied down?" Trask swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally emerged, was thin. He didn't show proper clearance. We were told—" "That's because," Caden interrupted, his voice finally breaking the silence like a blade, "I don't show anything to cowards who judge before they ask." The weight of his words hit harder than the opening doors. A sharp exhale passed through the watching passengers, some of whom had stood halfway from their seats, unsure of what to believe anymore. Others lowered their heads, guilt creeping into their faces for having watched in silence. Riker raised a hand, and 2 operatives stepped forward. Body cameras already rolling, they held legal files marked with federal clearance tags. "Everyone responsible for the unlawful detainment of Mr. Miles is now under federal inquiry," one operative announced, his voice steady, practiced, and unshaken. Trask lifted a hand to protest. "You don't understand. We had protocols." He was flagged in our system. You didn't have a system, Riker cut in coldly. You had fear disguised as policy. Menders stepped back slowly, but another officer blocked his retreat. The list of charges was read aloud without pause. Unlawful restraint, abuse of authority, obstruction of a classified operation. The words sank like anchors. Trask's shoulders dropped as if a weight had been dropped on his back. He looked around for support, but no one moved. Even the junior staff stood still, unwilling to share in the shame. Meanwhile, Caden reached down slowly and picked up his briefcase. His fingers ran across its smooth surface, a reminder that the mission was still alive, still urgent. His gaze swept the room one final time. I said nothing, he said, turning his eyes once more to Trask, because I wanted to see how far you'd go. You didn't disappoint. The lounge was silent, eerily so until the restraints were undone and Caden Miles rose from the black chair. His movements were slow but precise, like a man reclaiming not just his posture, but his authority. The zip ties dropped to the floor with a quiet snap. For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then scattered clapping began, hesitant, uncertain. Passengers who had moments ago watched silently as he was bound now offered awkward gestures of support, unsure whether to be ashamed, relieved, or merely entertained. Caden didn't react. His face remained unreadable as he adjusted the sleeves of his dark suit. The gag lay on the ground like a discarded symbol of everything they had misunderstood about him. His eyes didn't scan the room. They locked forward. Riker Vale stepped beside him, face grim, voice low. The entire flight manifests under review, he said. We've grounded the crew, flagged the airline. Caden gave a brief nod, his gaze already shifting toward the exit. Good, he said. But his tone wasn't satisfied. It was focused. The expression on his face made it clear. This wasn't about justice. Not yet. As they exited the terminal, the escort team shielded them from reporters gathering beyond the glass. Caden moved like a man with seconds to spare. His mind had already returned to the chip inside the briefcase. It pulsed with quiet urgency, its internal systems calibrated to a strict timeline. If he didn't reach Coburn within 2 hours, a key segment of the Republic's national defense grid would enter autonomous lockdown, cutting off internal encryption, disrupting cross-border intelligence, and disabling satellite-linked defense drones. In short, a nation would blink in the dark. Outside, a sleek jet waited on a private runway. Its engines idled low, heat shimmering off the tarmac beneath the gray dusk sky. As the team approached, the side door slid open and Kelron Maddox, the operative who'd acted as Caden's silent observer, stepped out. Gone was the janitor uniform. He now wore a dark tactical jacket, his expression tight with urgency. He met Caden at the ramp and handed him a small matte black drive. We have everything, he said. Angles, timestamps, even audio. Full coverage. It's clean. Caden took the drive without a word, slipping it into an inner pocket. He glanced briefly over his shoulder. Trask and Menders were nowhere in sight, already under containment most likely. The jet's cabin lights flickered as Caden stepped aboard. Inside, the aircraft smelled of leather and steel. Minimal, efficient, no champagne trays or reclining lounges. This wasn't luxury. It was precision transport. He took a seat near the front and placed the briefcase on the table in front of him. His fingers moved swiftly over the biometric locks. A soft click, and the case opened to reveal a circular chip about the size of a coin, embedded within a transparent sphere. He checked the indicator light. Green. Still active. Still alive. For now. Kelron sat across from him, opening a secured laptop already synced to the central database. The moment we land, I'll push the footage to the encrypted vault and prep the broadcast channel, he said. Caden looked up from the chip. Don't release it yet. Kelron hesitated. Why not? Public deserves to know. They will, Caden replied, voice low but firm. But not before the mission's done. This chip can't be delayed, not for any cause, even justice. If we miss the upload window, it resets the entire security lattice. You know what that means. Kelron gave a tight nod. He knew. Everyone in national defense knew. The chip contained a critical override patch designed to intercept a rapidly evolving cyber threat, a silent intrusion worm that had begun mutating faster than conventional firewalls could adapt. Only this code, written by Caden himself, could reinforce the Republic's digital perimeter. The engines roared louder now, and the aircraft began to move. Through the reinforced window, the lights of Varenza grew smaller, dimmer. Caden leaned back slightly, his fingers still resting on the briefcase. His thoughts wandered, briefly. Not to revenge, but to consequence. The airline would face it. The system that permitted this kind of profiling would feel it. But none of it mattered if the chip failed to reach Coburn. The mission wasn't personal, it was national. The cabin lights dimmed to travel mode. Riker's voice came through the comm panel. ETA 74 minutes. Airspace cleared. Caden didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small encrypted pad, and keyed in a single command. The chip's green light flickered in response, acknowledgement of the final flight phase. Kelron looked up. "We'll get there," he said quietly. Caden met his eyes for a moment, then looked back to the chip. His voice was calm, controlled, but colder than before. "We'll deal with the airline later. For now, we finish the mission." As the new plane lifted into the sky, one thing was clear. They hadn't just disrespected a man, they'd endangered the Republic's top covert system. They tied my hands, and in doing so, unraveled their own. The flight to Coburn sliced through the night sky with calm precision, but inside the private cabin, the air felt heavier than the altitude suggested. Caden Miles sat motionless, his seat reclined only slightly, the interior quiet but charged. He held the secure tablet Kelron Maddox had handed him, fingers gliding across the screen as footage played in sharp resolution. There was no need for sound. He could still hear it all. Every dismissive order, every accusatory stare, every second of silence that screamed prejudice. In the footage, his body remained bound to the metal chair, his face expressionless, but now, with distance, he saw the fuller picture. Trask pacing like a man drunk on authority, Menders stiff with ignorance masked as protocol, passengers shifting in their seats, some curious, others indifferent, most silent. Caden narrowed his eyes. "They acted like I was the danger," he muttered, almost inaudibly, but their fear was the real weapon. His voice, usually precise and restrained, now carried weight sharpened by insult. Across from him, Kelron Maddox sat upright, buckled in, his eyes scanning a different screen, one monitoring data packets from the failsafe chip inside the briefcase. "Signal's still clean," Kelron reported quietly, glancing toward Caden. "But if we don't interface it at Coburn before the window closes, we'll have to initiate fallback quarantines across the eastern cybergrid." Caden didn't reply. He knew the stakes. A vulnerability had been discovered in the Republic's core infrastructure, a hidden gateway that could allow hostile foreign entities to breach encrypted communications and override defense command chains. The patch in his possession, stored on a sealed crystal drive embedded in a microchip, was the only countermeasure. If it wasn't uploaded in time, entire sectors could go dark. His capture had nearly derailed everything. The aircraft began its descent. Below, the twinkling lights of Coburn's skyline came into view, the capital's defense summit already in full swing. Inside the marble-walled halls of the Citadel Conference Center, dozens of diplomats, analysts, and security directors paced, whispered, speculated. Agent Miles was expected hours ago. Rumors began to ripple. Some feared he'd been intercepted, others whispered of internal sabotage. As the executive jet landed on a private strip just beyond the conference center, a secure convoy awaited on the tarmac. Riker Vale stood at its head, flanked by a silent driver and two black-suited operatives. He gave a curt nod as Caden descended the steps, briefcase in hand, expression unreadable. No words were exchanged. The moment was too urgent for pleasantries. Inside the convoy, Caden sat in silence, fingers gently tapping the side of the case. The vehicle cut through Coburn's tightly secured streets under escort, headlights painting long shadows across government buildings and watchtowers. The tension wasn't spoken aloud, but it pulsed through every corner of the armored vehicle. If they failed to upload the patch within the next 40 minutes, the system would enter lockdown mode. Upon arrival, the vehicle bypassed main entrances and entered a fortified rear access tunnel. Caden, Kelron, and Riker were scanned through triple authentication checkpoints. "Any delay here?" Caden asked Riker, voice low but firm. Riker shook his head. "They've cleared the path to the control chamber. You just walk." Caden didn't walk. He strode. Through the echoing marble corridors of the summit building, his presence alone commanded silence. Conversation ceased. Heads turned. Some recognized him, others sensed his importance. The weight of his reputation preceded him. When he entered the summit hall, flanked by Riker and Kelron, the room seemed to still. The defense committee, seated at a long curved table on a raised platform, turned in unison. Committee chair Harlan Vex, a man known for his stern protocol, stood slowly. "Agent Miles," he greeted with formality and relief. "You've arrived." Caden nodded, but didn't break pace. He crossed the floor, briefcase in hand, and approached the secure core terminal, an obsidian console protected by biometric shields. Kelran stepped beside him, inputting access codes. The shield lowered with a soft hiss. Caden pressed his palm to the scanner. A soft pulse of light passed through his skin. The terminal opened. Inside the chamber, the chip was carefully extracted and slotted into the heart of the defense node. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft blue glow spread across the interface. A tone sounded, low and final. "Upload successful," the system confirmed. Relief flooded the room in waves. Chair Harlan Vex nodded, lips curling into the faintest smile. "A critical breach has just been avoided." He turned toward Caden and offered a precise salute. "You were late, but right on time." Caden looked back, voice steady, tone carved from stone. "And they'll never be on time to stop someone like me again. They tied him down like a threat just because of his color. If you believe no black man should be treated like a criminal for simply existing, subscribe now. This story demands eyes." The footage hit the public like a lightning strike. By mid-afternoon, news outlets scrambled to verify the source of a chilling video clip showing a well-dressed man of color, silent, restrained to a metal chair, gagged, surrounded by security guards in the Varenza terminal. The image alone sparked outrage, but once the full footage emerged, showing the man's calm cooperation, the dismissive remarks from Assistant Supervisor Nolan Trask, and the moment the restraints were applied without resistance or reason, the fury ignited into a firestorm. The watermark at the bottom corner read, "Confidential. Griffin Skyfleet internal feed." Kelran Maddox, blending into the background as always, had triggered the release. The whistleblower protocols were embedded deep in the Republic's intelligence network, ensuring no trace could be tied back to him. By the time the clip reached the Vire Sentinel, one of the Republic's most trusted independent outlets, the story was already trending on public message boards. Headlines began flashing across every major news screen within hours. Top national security agent wrongfully detained at Varenza terminal. Caden Miles, whose name was still withheld in official channels, sat in a secured chamber below the Coburn Defense Summit venue, watching the coverage unfold on a wall-mounted screen. His expression remained unchanged, calm, calculated, but his eyes were sharp. Kelran entered the room and placed a secure tablet on the table. "The fire's out of the bottle," Kelran said quietly. "No way they contain this." Caden didn't look at him right away. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, where footage showed Trask speaking over the restrained man. He looked dangerous. That's all we needed. A grainy, still frame froze on that moment before cutting back to the anchor's somber tone. "Good," Caden finally said, voice even. "Let them try and explain that." Across the city, protests were already forming outside Griffin Skyfleet's regional headquarters. Social media boiled with fury. Thousands of comments flooded the airline's official accounts demanding resignations, boycotts, and criminal charges. The airline's response came quickly, but not effectively. A short video statement from a corporate spokesperson read from a teleprompter. "We regret the unfortunate mistake that occurred involving a passenger earlier this week. Our team followed security protocol and acted in good faith. We are reviewing the matter internally." Caden watched the statement twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Kelran broke the silence. "They think this will blow over." "It won't," Caden replied. That evening, Caden was summoned to Ardent Hall for a private meeting with President Alrik Voren. The presidential chamber was quiet, shielded from the media frenzy. The only sound was the low hum of encrypted surveillance dampeners. The president stood near the wide glass window, arms folded, looking out over the Republic Capitol. Caden entered without ceremony, flanked by Riker Vale, who stayed behind as the door sealed shut. The president turned slowly. His expression was one of restrained anger, not at Caden, but at what had been done to him. "Sit," the president said. Caden did. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then President Voren walked closer, placing a printed copy of the Vire Sentinel report on the table between them. "Is it all true?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Caden nodded. "Every second." The president took a deep breath, then slowly exhaled. You know. When I appointed you to this tier, I thought the clearance would be enough. That the position, the suit, the mission, you'd be recognized, respected. Caden met his eyes. They didn't see any of that, just a threat with a heartbeat. President Voren's lips pressed into a line. That's the part that burns. That a man like you, carrying the Republic's lifeblood in a briefcase, could be strapped down like cargo. Then maybe it's time we stop apologizing, Caden said, leaning forward, voice low and firm, and start restructuring. The president studied him in silence for a beat longer, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then let's start with Griffin. He didn't act like someone with clearance. Trask's voice echoed through the tribunal chamber, flat and defensive. He sat rigidly at the witness table, his uniform neatly pressed, hands clasped in front of him like a man trying to appear in control of a storm he had clearly unleashed. The room, a high-ceilinged hall within the Office of National Transit Oversight, was tense. Rows of press, tribunal officers, and civilian observers filled every seat. The spotlight, both literal and figurative, was on Trask, but he didn't seem to realize that his defense only made things worse. Riker Vale leaned forward from his seat beside the tribunal judge. His jaw tightened. His voice, when it came, was calm, but sharp as broken glass. What does someone with clearance look like to you? The silence that followed was crushing. It wasn't just the kind of silence that came from a lack of words, it was the kind that revealed something darker beneath. Trask blinked. His lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no sound came. A low murmur rippled through the audience, camera shutters clicked, pens scratched across notepads, and somewhere in the back, a security officer shifted uncomfortably. From the second row, Caden Miles sat still, dressed not in uniform but in a dark civilian suit. His eyes were unreadable, but beneath his calm exterior, his mind was razor-sharp. This wasn't just about personal vindication anymore. This was about proving a pattern, exposing the layers of silent bias buried in every protocol Griffin Skyfleet had disguised as procedure. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Trask, answer the question." Trask exhaled through his nose. "We've been trained to look for anomalies." His behavior was evasive. Caden rose slowly to his feet, requested by the judge to provide supplemental testimony. As he approached the center of the room, his polished shoes echoed against the hardwood floor. The tribunal chamber quieted again, this time with anticipation. Everyone knew the story by now, how he had been bound to a chair, gagged and detained without cause, but hearing it from him would make the truth land heavier. Caden stopped, looking straight ahead. "The only thing evasive that day was your willingness to ask a question before making a judgment." He let the words linger, his tone even, his posture unwavering. Across the room, Trask looked away. The judge gave a subtle nod. "Mr. Miles, in your own words, why do you believe this incident occurred?" Caden didn't hesitate. "Because I looked like someone who wasn't supposed to belong. It didn't matter that I had clearance. It didn't matter that I followed protocol. What mattered was the shape of my silence and the shade of my skin." He paused, turning to face the tribunal. "And now I've started an internal audit," he continued, "one that is already revealing I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last if we do nothing." The tribunal allowed him to elaborate. What followed was a presentation of case files Caden's team had begun compiling. He displayed names, times, and descriptions of incidents eerily similar to his own, each victim detained, profiled, or delayed under vague reasoning. The most disturbing among them was the case of Devin Cole, a young systems engineer from the Southern District. He had been blocked from boarding a domestic flight 2 months prior due to what security labeled a mismatch in ID tone. Devin had been forced to miss a critical government contractors meeting, one that would have advanced his entire division. His complaint had gone unanswered. Devin sat in the back of the room now, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes downcast. But when Caden mentioned his name, he looked up. "I spoke with Devin personally," Caden said. "He told me he doubted himself after it happened. Thought maybe he had done something wrong. But he hadn't. He was only guilty of existing in the wrong place in someone else's mind." A heavy stillness settled over the tribunal. The audience had moved from curiosity to outrage. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The judge leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowed. "Mr. Miles, do you believe this constitutes a systemic issue?" "I do," Caden replied, "and I intend to expose every name, every case, every algorithm that let it happen." Trask began to shift uncomfortably, realizing now that the tribunal was no longer questioning Caden, they were questioning him. He glanced at Menders, seated a few chairs away, whose face had gone pale. Riker watched it unfold with a practiced expression, but inside he felt the tide finally turning. This wasn't a single complaint anymore. It was a reckoning, and the more they tried to explain it away, the more guilty they looked. Later that evening, back in a secure conference room, Caden reviewed a wall filled with printed case files and digital reports. He stood in front of the board, arms crossed, eyes scanning name after name. He traced one line of text with his finger and spoke quietly to Riker and Kelran Maddox, who were seated nearby. "This is deeper than we thought. They've been running predictive flagging based on appearance cues." Riker sat forward. "You mean facial recognition?" "No," Caden said, pointing at a section of code. "I mean something worse. An AI-based visual matrix, ranking perceived threat levels based on body language, skin tone, attire." Kelran's jaw tightened. "You're saying the system itself was trained to fear certain people?" Caden nodded grimly. "Which means this wasn't an accident. It was engineered." He turned to face them fully. "They didn't just tie me down. They tied down progress, and I'm here to cut the rope." The cameras were already rolling when the spokesperson for Griffin Skyfleet stepped up to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. A sea of reporters filled the room, their pens ready, their expressions sharp and unforgiving. The backdrop behind him displayed the company's logo, a silver-winged emblem that now felt more like a target than a symbol of prestige. "We acknowledge a breakdown in protocol," the spokesperson began, reading from a carefully typed sheet, "and offer our deepest regrets to the affected individual." His voice was controlled, almost mechanical, but the air in the press room was electric with tension. No one was buying the rehearsed sincerity. The murmurs among the press corps turned into a quiet buzz of skepticism. This wasn't the apology the public had waited for. It was damage control in a suit and tie. Then it happened. A tall journalist in the second row, a man with sharp features and piercing eyes, stood up without waiting for permission. His voice was calm but carried the weight of a question that had echoed in millions of minds across the country. Would this have happened if he weren't black? The room fell silent. The spokesperson blinked. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. The carefully curated apology had no answer for that. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of discomfort on his face. Meanwhile, far from the flash of microphones and stage-managed contrition, Caden Miles sat in a dimly lit conference room across town. The air inside was still, the atmosphere more solemn than tense. A monitor displayed live coverage of the press conference, muted. Caden's attention wasn't on the man at the podium. It was on the three individuals seated across from him, three men who, like him, had been silenced, profiled, restrained. Devin Cole, a quiet systems engineer in his late 20s, fidgeted with the zipper of his jacket. Beside him sat Malik Desro, a medical student with tired eyes, and Terrence Shaw, a logistics consultant who hadn't spoken a word since entering the room. At first, the men were hesitant to speak. Shame clung to them like fog. They shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure of how much to share or whether it was worth sharing at all. Caden broke the silence. He reached into a folder and tapped a remote. A screen flickered to life, revealing the footage Kelran Maddox had captured at the terminal. High definition, unflinching, time-stamped. It showed him tied to the black metal chair, gagged. It showed the smirks, the dismissive gestures, the crew's indifference. "You're not crazy," Caden said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on Devin. "You're not alone, and you're not going to be silent anymore." Something shifted in the room. Malik leaned forward, his knuckles white. "I told them I was carrying medical samples. They said I looked tense. They strapped me down in a private room and searched everything I had. No apology, just suspicion." Terrence finally spoke, his voice low. "They said my badge looked fake, made me wait 3 hours in a holding area, missed my mother's funeral flight, never even asked why I was traveling." Devin nodded slowly. "I thought, maybe I had done something wrong. Maybe I didn't look the part." Caden leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "You looked like yourselves. That was enough to be a problem." The room grew heavy again, not with silence but with clarity. They had carried these stories alone for years. Now they had a reason to share them, and someone who knew exactly how to use them. By late afternoon, they had filled out formal grievance forms. But that wasn't enough. Not this time. Together, they created something bigger. A document. A strike of clarity. They called it the Bound Passenger Files, a living report detailing every known case of wrongful restraint, unjust profiling, and racially driven detainment by Griffin Skyfleet over the past 5 years. Caden handed the structure of the report to a legal contact Riker had vetted. They embedded it with Riker's classified security audits and Kelrin's time-stamped footage, giving it both narrative weight and irrefutable proof. The plan wasn't just legal, it was surgical. One document, 4 names, years of silent suffering now bound together into a single, undeniable truth. The screen in the corner showed the press conference winding down. The spokesperson had abandoned the script. His voice faltered, and the room was no longer listening to him. They were waiting for the real story, the one Caden was about to give them. He turned to the men beside him, each still processing what they'd just shared. "They built their empire on silence," Caden said, rising from his chair, eyes burning with focus. "We're about to turn the volume all the way up. Bring up Exhibit 9. The judge's voice was firm, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. The screens behind the tribunal bench flickered for a moment before stabilizing. What appeared next left the entire courtroom frozen. Rows and columns of coded data flashed across the monitor, sorted by attributes such as complexion tone, attire type, beard density, facial expression variability, and accent identification. At the top, in bold digital font, read the title, Visual Risk Matrix, Experimental Passenger Threat Index version 3.1, internal use only. The silence was immediate. Caden Miles stood beside the presentation terminal, arms crossed, face composed. His eyes remained locked on the bench, not needing to turn toward the display to know what it was. He had reviewed it in private hours earlier, filed deep within the airline's supposedly secure server. It hadn't been easy to decrypt, but now, under oath and on record, it was going to change everything. On the other side of the room, Trask sat stiff in his seat. The flush of his cheeks contrasted sharply with the pallor climbing up his neck. Menders, seated just behind him, blinked rapidly and clutched his hands together as if the posture could summon stability. The judge leaned forward. "Let me understand this clearly. You used an algorithm to judge passengers' threat levels, based on clothing and skin?" The courtroom held its breath. Trask opened his mouth, but Menders spoke first, voice dry and mechanical. "It was part of our predictive safety program. The Matrix pulled visual cues and matched them against archived behavioral profiles. It wasn't personal." "Not personal," the judge echoed, voice sharp. He pointed toward the screen. "It has skin tone scores. It has a beard length indicator. What exactly isn't personal about it?" "We were told it improved security," Menders said again, lower this time, shrinking into himself. The judge turned slowly to the panel beside him, then back toward Caden. His gaze wasn't angry, it was heavy with disappointment. "You didn't improve anything," he said quietly. "You just gave fear a spreadsheet." Gasps echoed from the audience seats, rippling like a wave. The journalists in the press row exchanged wide-eyed glances. The plaintiff counsel nodded solemnly. But Caden did not move. Inside his chest, his heart thudded, not with anxiety but with weight, the kind of gravity that comes when truth is no longer theoretical, when it's not a whisper behind closed doors, but a blade laid bare before the world. The visual risk matrix had been the shadow weapon, and now it had a face. The judge rubbed his temples briefly, then gestured toward the defense. "Do you deny authorizing this program?" Trask finally found his voice, though it cracked. I wasn't in charge of the design. We were given the tool. We didn't know the full extent of its metrics. Yet you used it," the judge said flatly, "to detain citizens, to restrain Mr. Miles." The courtroom fell still again. Outside, through the tall windows behind the bench, dozens of protesters stood with placards. "Untie the truth. Every chair leaves a mark." The slogans, bold and clear, swayed in unison with the wind. But inside, only one voice mattered now. Caden finally stepped forward. Every eye turned to him. He didn't look at Trask. He didn't look at Menders. He looked at the bench. "I stayed silent when they strapped me down," he began, voice low and measured. "I let them think I was helpless. I wanted to see how far the system would go when no name, no badge, no clearance could protect me. He paused. No one interrupted. I knew what I was carrying. I knew the value of the data in that case. But they didn't see any of that. All they saw was me, my face, my silence, my presence, and that was enough for them to write a narrative, one that fit inside their matrix. He took another step. The floor echoed under his polished shoes. This wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about threat management. It was about fear, given a form, given code, given rules, and unleashed with impunity. He turned slightly now, just enough to face the gallery of attendees, officials, media, victims, advocates. They said I looked like a threat, Caden said, voice tightening. So I became one, to the system they abused. The judge leaned back in his seat. The room remained silent, but the energy had shifted. No one moved, no one spoke. Somewhere in the back, someone stifled a tear. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the glass as if the skies themselves had come to listen. Inside, the judge lowered his gavel without a word, not to strike, but to rest his hand beside it. Your chains, he said, voice heavy, have started something they won't be able to stop. The ruling came down in a packed tribunal room, the kind that hummed with quiet expectation and held its breath just before a verdict. At the center sat the 3 presiding justices of the National Transit Commission, their faces stern, eyes unreadable. The lead judge, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses and a steady voice, leaned forward and said clearly, "This tribunal finds Griffin Skyfleet in violation of national transit protocols and civil rights statutes. Effective immediately, the company is ordered to issue full restitution to all documented victims of discriminatory restraint procedures." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The press had filled the gallery. Cameramen steadied their lenses, journalists' fingers hovered over keyboards. Caden Miles sat at the edge of the plaintiff's table, posture straight, eyes focused, expression unreadable. To his left was Agent Riker Vale, arms crossed, jaw clenched. On Caden's right, Kelvin Maddock sat slightly forward, the scar near his left temple catching the light every time he blinked. This was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The judge continued, his voice firm. All personnel directly involved in the unlawful restraint protocol are to be removed from transportation roles until they undergo complete recertification and psychological clearance. Furthermore, Griffin Skyfleet's internal AI-based profiling system is to be open to third-party forensic audit and compliance review. Across the aisle, the defense team froze. Griffin's lead counsel, a tall man with a blue tie and a sheen of sweat on his brow, gripped the edge of his binder. Behind him, the company's board members sat in stiff silence, their rebranding campaign already beginning to crumble in their minds. But it wasn't just the punishment that stunned the room. It was what came next. In addition, the judge said, by executive order, the President has signed into law the establishment of the Equity in Transit Oversight Board, an independent civilian military council designed to investigate and resolve airport discrimination claims across all domestic carriers. He paused briefly before delivering the final blow. This board will be chaired by Mr. Caden Miles. The room erupted. Flashbulbs burst like lightning strikes. News tickers began to update live. Caden remained still, his breathing calm, his focus anchored. But inside, there was a storm of thoughts. The chair they had forced him into, the silence he had been wrapped in, the humiliation that wasn't just his, but shared by countless others who hadn't been recorded, who hadn't been saved in time. Later that day, during a nationally broadcast press briefing outside Ardent Hall, Caden stood before a sea of microphones. Reporters hurled questions, some chaotic, others cutting. Mr. Miles, how do you respond to the tribunal's decision? What reforms will the board implement first? Do you feel vindicated? Caden raised a hand for silence. He looked out over the crowd, his voice steady when he finally spoke. They gave me a chair, he said, letting the words settle. Now I'm building my own table. The next morning, the board held its first closed-door session inside the Transit Command Center in Selvan District. The room was a fusion of government precision and digital firepower. Transparent displays floated above the desks, biometric logs flickered on secure tablets, and a large touchscreen map tracked passenger movement patterns across every major terminal. Caden stood at the head of the table facing 12 men, officers, analysts, legal architects, and civilian rights advisors. All handpicked, all vetted, All male, each one tasked with dismantling the infrastructure of fear that had been allowed to thrive. "We begin with biometric passenger integration," Caden announced. "Every passenger's identity data must be encrypted, validated, and cross-verified without visual bias. No more override codes based on subjective threat flags. No more digital profiles triggered by the color of a jacket or skin." One of the advisors, a quiet strategist named Bryn Talcott, tapped into the framework. "We'll need to reprogram the entire threat detection AI architecture. Most of it is embedded in legacy systems." "Then start rewriting," Caden replied. "Piece by piece. The board's first motion is this. Biometric clearance systems must run independently of human flagging. No override, no gut instinct, just the data." The vote was unanimous. As the meeting concluded, Agent Riker walked beside Caden through the corridor, the polished floor reflecting the overhead blue security lights. "You just changed the way air travel works in this country," Riker said, voice low. "No," Caden replied, eyes forward. "I just stopped it from working the way it wasn't supposed to in the first place." They passed a hallway mural depicting unity among passengers, diverse figures moving through airports with ease, no ropes, no zip ties, no suspicion. A future that had once felt distant was now in progress. Outside, protesters gathered, not in rage but in support. They held up signs that read, "Real security doesn't fear color, respect is a right," and one that caught Caden's eye. "Tied down once, standing forever." Inside his private office, a sleek space just off the command floor, Caden opened a thin case on his desk. Inside was the original black zip restraint they had used on him at Varenza Terminal. He stared at it for a moment, then quietly placed it into a glass display box beside the door. A reminder, not of weakness, but of clarity. Later that evening, a final press release circulated from the office of the President, confirming the formation of the Oversight Board and detailing its authority. Within minutes, the nation responded. The public saw it as justice. The transport industry saw it as a warning. But for Caden Miles, it was something else entirely. He stood once again before the cameras, reporters waiting for another quote. But this time, he kept it short. "No one," he said, "should be tied down because someone else fears their presence." The press conference began under dim lights and tighter security. In a sleek building bearing a freshly installed sign that read Altair Unity Airways, executives stood stiffly behind a podium adorned with a new blue-gold logo. Their suits were perfect, their words rehearsed, but nothing about their presence could erase the memory burned into the public mind. "We are proud to announce a new chapter," the spokesman declared, his voice measured but nervous. "Altair Unity represents our commitment to equity, excellence, and healing." Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, but the room remained cold. Outside the glass-paneled hall, protesters lined the boulevard. Some held signs. "A new name can't bury old chains." Others chanted Caden's name. The temperature wasn't just physical, it was moral. No one watching believed the rebrand was sincere. The air tasted of damage control, not reform. Inside a separate chamber, Caden Miles sat before a semicircular table of civilian and military board members. The walls were lined with digital screens displaying data streams, grievance reports, and real-time sentiment graphs pulled from news media. Since taking leadership of the Equity and Transit Oversight Board, Caden had reviewed nearly 400 passenger reports, each one a crack in the illusion of safety and fairness. He tapped his finger against the edge of a tablet, brows furrowed. His face remained still, but his mind was racing. "This one was denied a seat upgrade," said Nolan Reese, a young analyst seated beside him, sliding a file forward. "He was told his reservation had vanished, but it turns out the seat went to someone who booked 10 minutes later. Same route, same class." Caden scanned the passenger photo. A black man in his late 20s, a software engineer traveling for a tech conference. His ID was flagged with a vague code, AUX-R5. No explanation, no recourse, just a mysterious tag placed by Griffin's former system, still lingering in Altair's infrastructure like a ghost that refused to leave. "Same algorithm?" Caden asked quietly, his eyes locked on the data stream. Reese nodded. "Still embedded in their archives, slightly modified cosmetically, but functionally the same." Caden's voice was calm but cold. "Then it's not reform. It's camouflage." Across the table, Riker Vale, dressed in a charcoal military uniform, leaned forward. We shut the door on overt discrimination, and they built a tunnel underneath. Caden said nothing. He simply closed the tablet and stood. The motion caught everyone's attention. I want a full audit of all digital flagging systems still in use by Altair, he ordered. No masks, no name changes. I want to know if passengers are still being coded before they speak a word. Reese stood as well. We'll run a line-by-line strip through their architecture. Make it public, Caden added. Transparency is only painful to the guilty. Later that day, Caden stepped into a studio for the launch of their new campaign. A dramatized reenactment played on a muted screen behind him. It showed a man being stopped at a terminal. Calm, composed, well-dressed, he is asked to step aside. The voiceover said, "This is how silence begins." Another cut showed a security agent whispering, then restraining the man for non-compliance. The final shot faded to black, then words lit the screen. Seen. Heard. Unbound. The message was simple. You belong here. Caden didn't stay for applause. He left through the side corridor where Kelvin Maddox waited with a fresh stack of reports in hand. You're scheduled for an interview at Crestview Media, he said, then 2 university invites, and a summit request in East Rilmar. Caden took the files, flipping through the first few pages. Tell them no to the cameras. If they want to listen, they can read. Kelvin raised a brow. Still not ready for the spotlight? It's not about readiness, Caden said, tucking the file under his arm. It's about noise. Everyone wants a soundbite. I'm not giving them one. He entered the board's briefing room again just as a new file loaded on the screen. The name was familiar. Devin Cole. One of the earliest victims he had met. A quiet man who once whispered his story like it was a confession. But now, his name was beside a case number, marked Testimony Accepted. Status, Action Pending. Caden stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't about closure, it was about momentum. A reporter later cornered him outside, microphone ready. Mr. Miles, how do you respond to critics saying your campaign is making airlines afraid to enforce safety? Caden didn't pause. They should be afraid of mistaking fear for policy. And what would you say to those waiting for justice, still feeling unheard? Caden's gaze sharpened. Tell them I see them. The reporter lowered the mic. The crowd, previously buzzing, fell silent. And with that, Caden stepped into the transport awaiting him, ready for the next battle. Change, he said at one event, doesn't come with applause. It comes with endurance. 1 year after the incident, Caden Miles stepped through the newly reinforced entrance of Varenza Terminal. The air smelled of fresh paint and sterilized reform, but the memories hit him like invisible waves. He didn't pause. There was no need for reflection, not yet. His boots tapped quietly against the polished floor, and the badge on his lapel bore a new title, Inspector, Equity in Transit Oversight Board. No longer a silent operative, no longer a man restrained in plain sight. Today, he wasn't here as cargo. He was here as consequence. He moved past the terminal checkpoint without fanfare. The guards stood at full attention, not from fear, but from awareness. Caden nodded once. That was enough. Down the corridor, glass walls framed a space that had once been a boarding lounge. Now it bore a new identity. Center for Respect-Based De-Escalation Training. A stark banner stretched overhead, steel gray with cobalt text. Beneath it, fresh recruits sat in rows, listening to a speaker point at a projected simulation. Caden observed through the glass, his face unreadable. As he entered, silence fell. The instructor, a retired commander named Elias Thorne, nodded respectfully and stepped aside. All eyes turned to the man whose restraint had rewritten airport policy. But Caden didn't speak. Not yet. His gaze drifted across the room, scanning the trainees. Young, alert, some nervous, some curious. One recruit, a lanky man no older than 22, shifted awkwardly as Caden passed. He bore the uniform of Griffin's rebranded wing, now merged under federal oversight. The room was immaculate, organized with military precision. Posters lined the far wall. One showed a silhouette of a bound metal chair beneath stark words. One mistake can ground a nation. Another displayed data points, cases of racial profiling over the last decade, a timeline of incidents, and the reforms initiated since. Caden stood before it for a long moment. Outside the classroom, the hall buzzed with low conversation. Caden stepped into the corridor, letting the door swing closed behind him. His eyes drifted to the far end, where a large plaque had been mounted beneath a soft spotlight. He walked toward it, boots echoing faintly in the space. The inscription read, "Dedicated to those unjustly silenced, may their strength reshape the skies." He stood there, unmoving, until a soft voice drew his attention. "Sir?" a young voice said. Caden turned slightly. A new recruit stood beside an elderly man in a traveler's cap, holding a worn leather bag. The recruit was helping him with a biometric scanner that had misread the traveler's ID chip. There was no frustration, no harshness, just quiet patience. The recruit smiled gently and said, "Take your time, sir. We're here for you." The old man nodded, visibly relieved. Caden watched the scene unfold without a word. For a moment, the noise of the terminal faded. The tension that once hung in these walls like thick smoke was replaced by something cautious but genuine. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't finished, but it was different. Riker Vale's voice echoed in Caden's memory. "Every chair leaves a mark." And this terminal bore many, but now those marks were being studied, not hidden. Caden turned back to the plaque, running 2 fingers lightly across the etched metal. The chill of it bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. Behind him, the hallway continued, offices, briefing rooms, surveillance training bays. His job would take him through all of them in time. He'd evaluate, audit, recommend, and correct. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for rhythm, structure, change, and though his name wasn't carved into the marble, his presence lingered in every corridor. A staff member approached. "Inspector Miles, your next review's in the South Wing. Shall I walk you there?" "In a minute," Caden replied, eyes still fixed on the words before him. The staff member hesitated, then nodded and stepped away. The lounge had once held his silence hostage. Now it held the blueprint for how silence would never return. Caden closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to remember the feel of zip restraints, the judgment in a guard's eyes, the sting of being gagged without cause. He opened them again with steady calm. He didn't need applause. He didn't need fanfare. He needed the system to never forget what it had tried to erase. And so, with one final glance at the plaque, Caden placed a hand on the cold metal. He didn't smile. He didn't weep. But something in his posture shifted, firmer, settled. He didn't need recognition. He needed the silence to stay broken. They tied me to stop a threat, but all they did was set a purpose free. They gagged him, tied him, and called him a danger. But they had no idea he worked for the president. If you believe dignity can't be chained, subscribe and be part of the change. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It confronts themes of racial profiling, injustice, and the dangerous assumptions that fuel discrimination. This narrative aims to raise awareness, challenge systemic bias, and inspire empathy and accountability in the pursuit of true justice.